Gabriel, you are the author of the recently released book, The Coming Storm, A Journey into the Heart of the Conspiracy Machine, which accompanies your award-winning podcast series produced by Lucy Proctor. Today, we're going to be going down the rabbit hole, hopefully back out again.
Oh, it's all right. I'll bring you back out. Don't worry.
Looking at how conspiracy theories have torn American politics apart for the last 3 decades and what kind of stage this has set for the upcoming 2024 election. The title.
Yes.
The Coming Storm.
Yes.
What is it and when's it coming?
It's coming soon. I don't know. There are 2 storms, basically. The storm was this idea in QAnon, this kind of crazy conspiracy theory that gripped American politics in the run-up to the last presidential election. So it really came to prominence in 2020, about a cabal of satanic paedophiles who may or may not have been led by Hillary Clinton, who was secretly controlling America and stealing the 2020 election. And this anonymous figure, Q, who was posting on this niche website called 4chan, kept talking about a coming storm. And the storm in this narrative was the moment when the cabal would be exposed, the deep state traitors would be tried, and some of them executed. This is what all these believers were waiting for it to happen. And when they saw January the 6th, they thought, this is it. This is the storm. But there's another coming storm, which kind of begins after January the 6th. And it is this idea, this wider conspiracy theory that has gripped America, which is that the institutions of the state have been captured by a malign force that kind of crosses politics, finance, banking, tech, entertainment, and that these people together, look, we think, we hear this narrative all the time about, if Trump wins in this election, democracy is in trouble, this election may be America's last. These guys think, and there are tens of millions of them, it's a significant portion of the electorate, think that democracy has already been subverted by this deep state. So basically, the second storm I'm talking about is, when we get to the election in November, there are 2 possible options, right? Either Trump wins and he does try to dismantle some of the institutions of democracy, and we will see whether those institutions are robust enough to withstand it, or Kamala Harris wins and this significant chunk of the electorate believes their election has been stolen again because for sure Trump's not going to admit defeat. And so what then happens to American democracy?
And neither outcome is particularly palatable, is it?
Both outcomes seem scary. They keep me awake at night. But there are people, as you will read in the book towards the end, who look at this kind of threat to democracy and think, yay, we love it. Because there's this whole kind of cadre of tech bro, libertarian, Silicon Valley billionaires, some of whom were sort of peripherally involved in the kind of beginnings of QAnon and all these conspiracy theories, who just can't wait for democracy to collapse so that they can replace it with their anarcho-capitalist CEO kings who will rule the world.
We will come back to the present day. I want to start by going all the way back, though. And there is one figure, very high-profile political figure, who spans the entire period that you're talking about in the book. Hillary Clinton in particular, but the Clintons. And she's at the centre and Bill is at the centre of these conspiracy theories. And I just wonder, how much did the 90s Clinton presidency set the landscape of what we see today in conspiracy land?
I kind of feel like the 90s is the decade where everything happened, right? I grew up in the 90s and it felt like the decade where nothing happened. It was the end of the Cold War. It was the end of history. And, it was the consensus decade, right? It was New Labour. It was Bill Clinton. But actually, beneath the surface, everything, all the trouble that is now bursting onto the surface like a hideous pustule was brewing in the 90s. So because of the centrality in the QAnon conspiracy theory of Hillary Clinton as the kind of notional leader of this.
Why do you think she is?
Well, I mean, let's see. So this was my question when I started out. Why Hillary Clinton? Why?
Yeah.
Well, obviously she was running for president, and she was a hate figure for people on the right, for anti-feminists, all of which was kind of gaining traction online at the time. But I thought, let's go back to the origins, right? Let's go back to the 1990s when the Clintons moved up from Arkansas and moved into the White House. And of course, Hillary Clinton was it was the first time a woman with a career of her own, high-powered lawyer, had been First Lady. She wasn't just going to, sit around picking curtains for the residents. She put an office in the West Wing, right, the political heart of the White House. So immediately she's ruffling feathers politically. But this is all above the surface. Beneath the surface, other stuff is happening. So Bill and Hillary come up from Arkansas, and they bring a bunch of their Arkansas buddies with them. And one of them is this lawyer called Vince Foster. He goes to the same nursery school as Bill Clinton in Hope, Arkansas. Bill Clinton's White House chief of staff also went there. So it must have been the most high-powered nursery school in all of American political history. Anyway, Vince Foster becomes deputy White House counsel, one of the most senior lawyers in the White House. And in the summer of 1993, he commits suicide. He kills himself. So there's 4 or 5 investigations into this. They all conclude he committed suicide. There are some kind of holes in the investigation, loose threads, things that don't quite add up. And out of this, a big conspiracy is spun. It starts on talk radio stations, on these weird financial newsletters, but then, the nascent internet, which is at that moment being born. And Vince Foster becomes the beginning, the kernels of what will become something called the Clinton body count. So if you spend enough time on the kind of conspiratorial end of the American political spectrum, you will hear about the Clinton body count. And it's this theory that the Clintons, Hillary and Bill, in their unceasing quest for power, have basically risen atop a kind of mountain of bodies. There are 50 bodies, there are more, who knows? And Vince Foster is not chronologically the first, but he's kind of ground zero. So this story about Vince Foster, it was bubbling away beneath the surface, but because there were so many weird conspiracy theories already then circling around the Clintons, mainstream establishment journalism, the New York Times, the Washington Post, they didn't want to get their hands dirty on this stuff because, they'd be associated with the Clinton crazies. So they just didn't touch any of it, right? All these allegations about corruption in Arkansas, some of which may have had grains of truth, they just kind of tried to ignore it as best they could. And that, as we would later find out, is a bad idea. In
every conspiracy theory, in order for it to be believed, there's got to be an element of truth, hasn't there?
It helps.
But I'm struck between, in these early years, these early Clinton years, you say the White House treated conspiracy theories about Vince Foster's death and stories about Bill Clinton's sexual transgressions with exactly the same disdain. But actually, while Vince Foster had not been murdered, Bill Clinton had sex with Monica Lewinsky. There's a danger, isn't there? And you say the New York Times, Washington Post, Wall Street Journal, they all ignored this. But actually, if you ignore something that's true, you're not holding truth to power. And then it makes these more crazy elements believable. You say, well, you didn't tell us the truth on this.
Yeah, so you're involved with the cabal. Right, so they did try to ignore the sex stuff for as long as they could. Obviously, they couldn't in the end. No. But when the Lewinsky story came out, Hillary Clinton memorably said there was a vast right-wing conspiracy against her and her husband, as if, this kind of stuff was just all made up. Now, Monica Lewinsky, whatever the improprieties and the power imbalance between the President of the United States and an intern in her early 20s, was nevertheless, as Monica Lewinsky herself would concede, a consensual relationship. There's another story in the book about Juanita Broaddrick, who alleges, quite credibly in my view, I should say that Bill Clinton's spokesman at the time denied it, but she alleges quite credibly, and she told other people at the time, that Bill Clinton raped her violently. All rape is violent, but, there was blood in a hotel room in Arkansas in 1978, right? And part of the reason why this is credible is she didn't want to tell the story. She wanted to move on. But she was forced to by the Star Inquiry, who came after her and subpoenaed her. So she was forced to tell her story. And they then buried it in the Star report. It wasn't anywhere to be found. So then her story comes out and everyone just ignores it, right? And to this day, when I interviewed people close to the Clintons, and they sort of feigned ignorance. Who is this person? So the narrative about the Clintons has completely sort of excised this stuff that is credible and should be looked at.
And what's the significance of that, do you think? Why is that so important to you?
Well, look, QAnon was essentially the convergence of two stories: abuse of power and sexual abuse, right? Which manifested itself in this conspiracy theory in the idea of paedophilia, right? Sexual abuse of children. And that was the kind of QAnon story. A cabal of satanic paedophiles had taken control of America. And these two elements, obviously not in literal form, but in sort of metaphorical form, the kind of total control of power which Bill Clinton electorally achieved through triangulation and basically occupying such a wide swathe of the centre ground that essentially all politics was basically Clintonian in the 90s. So he had all the power sewn up. And of course there were things that happened in Arkansas that looked dodgy, and, big boards of big companies that were, Hillary Clinton was on the board, and all these kinds of things that kind of smelt dodgy. No criminal liability was ever attached to the Clintons, but it smelt bad. And then there was the sex, right? So these two things, sex and power, existed within the Clinton narrative, and there were elements of truth to it. And it sort of morphed, mutated into what would later become QAnon.
And why do you think Hillary became so central and not Bill?
Well, partly because she was the one running for president in 2016, sure, when the internet was kind of coming of age, and all of this dark stuff was bursting out from 4chan and 8chan and all these weird notice boards. But also because Hillary, as this kind of powerful woman in politics, represented everything that the other side, which was a kind of weird coalition of incels online.
I mean, there's misogyny.
There's a huge, vast undertow of misogyny, but also liberalism. So it was a kind of a mixture of misogyny and liberalism, to put it quite simply.
Apart from obviously wanting to defeat Hillary Clinton, why and how did Trump attach himself to this, frankly, crazy narrative? One
of the people I interviewed for the book and the podcast, Fred Brennan, the guy who created the niche internet messaging board that basically incubated QAnon, he said, I think that Donald Trump and senior Republicans, they didn't really know what to make of QAnon. They didn't know where it was coming from, really, but they knew it was helpful to them. And there's that great clip, if you remember, this is in 2020, so when QAnon is suddenly coming to the fore in the run-up to the 2020 election. And it comes up at a White House briefing, and this reporter asks Donald Trump about it. And she says, so there's this theory that, Mr. President, that you are saving the world from this cabal of satanic pedophiles. Does that sound like something you're involved in? And he goes, well, I don't know much about it, but is that supposed to be a good thing or a bad thing? And I know they like me very much. So, he understands.
That was Donald Trump.
That was my impression of Donald Trump. He's got killer instincts, and he understands what is going to fire up his base. And he understood that this QAnon movement was powerful. And so, by the way, did people in his orbit who understood it much better than him, who were actively trying to, and you can read all about it, actively trying to hitch this crazy conspiracy theory movement that crawled out of the internet swamps of 4chan to a political campaign.
I mean, you talk to Fred Brennan a lot in the book. What does he make of it now? Is he full of remorse?
He didn't make up QAnon, right? He basically created the platform upon which QAnon thrived. And his whole idea at the time, this came out of this weird misogynist online movement called Gamergate, which was a very kind of in the weeds, complicated thing about computer games, basically, but it turned into a
female programmer.
Yeah, a female programmer.
Very successful game.
Made a game that was moderately successful. It wasn't like very successful, but all these.
That she'd slept with someone. Yeah, and that was why it was
all
successful.
These kind of incel-y type men online basically accused her of sleeping her way to a good review. It then kind of got much wider than that, and it just turned into this massive online misogynistic troll fest where people were getting threatened, where some of the women involved had to go into hiding, and it was a big deal. This was in 2014, and that was the sort of background to Fred Brennan, who. It was on 4chan, which was this kind of anarchic alt-right meme site, but they did have some rules, and the guy in charge of it was like, oh God, we don't want too much of this misogynistic weirdness because, they're deplatforming us. So he started taking it down. Fred Brennan, who was like this free speech absolutist, and also kind of a bit of an incel himself, was like, right, well, I'm going to create an alternative platform where anything goes, right? And so he created 8chan, and that was the incubator of QAnon.
But how does he feel about it now?
Well, he tried to get 8chan taken down, and it wasn't just QAnon. The 8chan, the Christchurch mosque attacker, put a manifesto out on 8chan. So he really tried and failed to get 8chan taken down. He's a funny character because on the one hand, he seemed to have some sort of sense of responsibility about all of that. On the other hand, he kind of said, yeah, I suppose you could say that, if I hadn't made 8chan, none of this would have happened. But actually, I think it would have happened elsewhere. So I think...
Do you think it would have?
Yeah, possibly. Yeah, I do. I mean, perhaps not quite in the same way. But yeah, probably 4chan would have done the job.
I want to talk about what it was like for you, you and Lucy, I suppose, over the last few years, throwing yourselves into this mad world. I mean, time and again in your meetings with people, you're viewed with suspicion because you are, by definition, you're covering this for the BBC. You are part of
deep state.
The deep state, capital D, capital S. I mean, how do you...
I'm not, for the record.
Well, you would say that, wouldn't you?
I would.
But how do you convince people that you are not part of the conspiracy, or is it just impossible?
It's kind of impossible. But our approach, me and Lucy, Lucy Proctor's sort of 50% of all of this. When I say it's really just me and Lucy doing this whole thing together. And we ended up in this QAnon conference in the spring of 2021. And we'd written to them officially from the BBC saying, hey, we want to accredit ourselves as journalists to your conference. Just got ignored. So in the end, we just bought tickets and turned up. The evening before, I remember me and Lucy sitting at a hotel in Dallas, trying to figure out how should we approach this? Should we go in and just pretend we're punters, like QAnoners from England? And we were just like, that's never going to work. Like, they're not, we're going to get rumbled in 2 seconds. So we decided on a policy of kind of maximum openness. We were going to go up to them and say, look, we wrote to you, you didn't respond. We bought tickets, but we're here from the BBC. We don't believe in any of the crazy stuff that you believe in, but we have come with an open mind because we think it's significant, so we'd like to come and cover your conference. So at first, they were very suspicious and they were not going to let us in. But weirdly, the more I kept saying, yeah, no, I don't believe the election was stolen, let alone by a cabal of satanic paedophiles, but I'm really interested to hear what you've got to say. The more I said I didn't believe in what they believed in, the more reassured they became. And eventually they were just like, yeah, okay, come on in.
Have you ever, at any point in the last 4 years, felt yourself going down the rabbit hole?
Yeah, I mean,
on what?
I did kind of fall down the rabbit hole in writing the book and doing the podcast. The rabbit hole I fell down was to do with this book, The Sovereign Individual, which is written by William Rees-Mogg, Jacob's dad, and another guy called James Dale Davidson. Written in the mid-90s.
There's some really strange relationships in this story.
Very strange relationships, right? And this is the conspiracy theorist dream, right? Yeah. It's the wall of crazy with the Post-its and the news clippings and the bits of string, right? So the guys who wrote this book, they predicted that the internet would basically cause so much turbulence that democracies would collapse and sovereign individuals would rise. So very much then the vision that I mentioned at the beginning, which is these kind of corporate CEOs, that, the nation state was over, a new thing was coming, the internet was going to be the thing that would break it and get ready. Now, these guys had also, incidentally, coincidence, been seeding conspiracy theories about Vince Foster in the 90s. So me and Lucy ended up in this kind of weird rabbit hole where we're like, hold on a second. They're there at the beginning, predicting, maybe promoting a situation where democracy kind of falls apart, and they're seeding the conspiracy theories that in our narrative is ground zero for QAnon. And then at the end you got January the 6th, you're like, was this all a big plan? Now, of course it wasn't all a big plan, right? That's the rabbit hole you go down, then you look at the facts and you go, okay, there's not enough here to suggest that this was some kind of genius, diabolical plan that they predicted the future. But what I think we can say is that these people had a certain vision of the future of the world, a kind of libertarian, anarcho-capitalist vision that they would like to see. And opportunistically, at various points, people and their kind of fellow travelers, which include people like Peter Thiel, founder of PayPal with Elon Musk, who incidentally, writes the foreword to this book, The Sovereign Individual.
Really?
Yeah. It's his favourite book, apparently.
Wow.
These people all adhere to this vision, and in a sense, the collapse of democracy, which we kind of sit around fretting about, they sit around going, this is great. This will be deregulation. Then we can do what we want. Peter Thiel famously said, I don't know how effective voting really is. If you really want to change the world, you can do so with technology. And the great thing about technology is that you don't have to ask anyone's permission. Technology at its best is anti-democratic.
It's terrifying. It's absolutely terrifying. Although you didn't obviously buy the overarching conspiracy. Is this something you thought was true that turned out not to be, or vice versa?
Well, I mean, there was the Hunter Biden laptop case, which occurred at the same time as I was first starting to look into QAnon, right? So just before the election in 2020, at the same time as I was hearing all these people going on about Q and the cabal of satanic paedophiles, they were also talking to me about Hunter Biden's laptop and how it exposed the kind of Biden crime family, quote unquote. And it may or may not have been kind of, linked to crazy tales of paedophiles, et cetera, et cetera. And when I heard about that, I just thought, oh God, I haven't got the bandwidth for this. It's just not another conspiracy theory. Well, a few years later, I ended up digging into it. I got hold of a copy of Hunter Biden's laptop. Turned out the whole thing was real. And what had happened in the run-up to the 2020 election was that when that story came out, it came out in the New York Post, tabloid newspaper, Murdoch run. Social media platforms, Facebook and Twitter censored it.
Yep.
Twitter actually locked the New York Post out of their Twitter account for spreading fake news. The FBI had gone to them and said, be on the lookout for fake news. So they thought that was it. 51 former heads of the CIA and the NSA and, big senior former spooks said, this is Russian disinformation. So the whole thing was kind of stamped upon. Turned out, not only was it true, but the FBI knew it was true because they had the laptop and they were using it in their investigations, right? So then you start thinking, maybe
well,
what else is true, right? Cock-up is always the more likely explanation. The much more likely explanation is that the people in the FBI who were going to Facebook and Twitter and warning them about Hunter Biden's laptop being disinformation didn't know that their colleagues 3 doors down the corridor had Hunter Biden's laptop in their drawer, right? That's a much more likely explanation. But you can see how people construct out of that a narrative of the deep state. In the face of kind of overwhelming craziness, mendaciousness from the Trump camp, there has been a tendency to button down the hatches on the opposite side, to say, not listening to any of this. This is all nonsense. Everything you say is nonsense, for fear of being kind of tarred with the conspiracy theorists. And also, by the way, everything is fine. The world is stop trying, leave the system be. Don't touch it. It's all good. Oh, it might fall apart. And actually, and this is the important thing about conspiracy theories. What conspiracy theories tell us is that everything is not fine. That the system is in deep trouble. That tens, maybe hundreds of millions of people don't believe it works for them anymore. And they have good reasons for not believing it works for them. And if you ignore them, then there will be a storm coming.
To what extent do you think the mainstream media have actually failed the wider public here?
I think that you will find nuances and good stories told everywhere. But I think the broader narrative, especially in the American media, if you'll see how they've become essentially partisan mouthpieces. I think it's very damaging. Towards
the end of the book, you write that the two conclusions followed from the past. Really, January the 6th failed. Therefore, another attempt is likely going to be made around the next election. Is that a prediction of yours if Trump doesn't win?
I don't want to be in the kind of position of predicting trouble. I think that's a bad idea. But I do think that it is fairly reasonable to assume that if Trump loses, he's not going to accept it.
Do you think that regardless of the scale of any victory or defeat?
I do, actually. I mean, I think it's going to be tight either way. But B, the man can't bear to be told his crowd sizes are small. So if he's defeated by a big margin, I think it's going to be even more difficult for him to concede defeat, right? If it's anyway, I think he's not going to accept it. And I think that's a fairly reasonable assumption. Then you have to ask the question, what are his supporters going to do? The people who genuinely believe that the last election was stolen, the tens of millions of people who believe that, they are going to believe their democracy is well and truly captured by the deep state.
I'm sorry to interrupt you, but I think it's worth fleshing out the numbers here because they are staggering, aren't they? Yeah. I mean, 6 months prior to the 2020 poll, you had the majority, wasn't it, of Americans saying they believed the government was corrupt and rigged.
So the poll,
and more than a quarter believing that it might soon be necessary to take up arms.
Well, there's a more recent poll than that. So December last year, there's a YouGov poll where they posed the following question or statement to Americans, and it's a serious poll, sample size more than 1,000, etc., etc. No matter who is officially in charge of the government or other institutions, a single group of people secretly control events and rule the world together.
So essentially QAnon.
Right. Minus the paedophile.
Yeah.
But we'll come back to this. What percentage do you think? Go on, give us a ballpark.
25%.
41.
41%.
That's getting on for half of all Americans, of the electorate. Anyway, according to a poll
this is not a niche problem, is what
This is not
saying.
a niche problem. And 25%... roughly, of Americans believed that senior politicians from both parties were involved in child sex trafficking. And so this is also not just a Republican problem, right? So conspiracy theories are everywhere, and you obviously don't want to take them literally, but you do want to take them seriously. And what they tell you is that the system is in trouble.
You're absolutely right that this is not just a Republican problem, because as we've seen during this election campaign, the assassination attempts on Trump, there have been some conspiracies on the left, haven't there, from Democrat supporters around the idea that Trump has staged his own assassination.
False flag.
I mean, do you think... I mean, those numbers seem to indicate that collectively the US, or maybe we all are, more open to conspiracy theories.
I think we are all open to conspiracy theories. I mean, remember when Donald Trump was a Kremlin agent? That was a conspiracy theory. I mean, there were grains of truth, but he wasn't a Kremlin agent, and the whole of the kind of liberal media bought into that, including myself. I bought into it. I tried to find out whether it's true, and I expended a lot of energy trying to find that P-tape. Spoiler alert, I didn't find it.
And nor did anyone else.
And nor did it exist, as far as we know.
But if we must take these seriously, what do you see as being a part of the solution? What can you do? What can be done against this level of a really dangerous belief in something that's so catastrophic potentially?
Well, I think. I mean, I genuinely don't have solutions. And for people this is a very real problem for people who've lost friends and family members to the conspiracy theory rabbit hole, which happens. And this is a very difficult thing to deal with. All I know is that, fact checking is not helpful. It doesn't work. It's counterproductive. I mean, obviously we should fact check stuff.
This is the worst thing we want to hear as
obviously we should fact check stuff as journalists.
Yeah.
But I'm saying confronting somebody who's gone down the rabbit hole with facts and saying it doesn't work. It just doesn't. It'd be nice if it did, but it doesn't. What I think the solution is, we need to take seriously the fact that the overarching narrative of all of these conspiracy theories is that the system is rotten. That's the metaphor. And the metaphor is important, and we need to listen to it. We need to not push it away, ignore it. We need to not pretend it was the Russians what done it, whether it's electing Trump or getting Brexit, it's not the Russians. Yes, the Russians were stirring the pot, but by saying it's the Russians, you negate your duty or obligation as a society to look in the mirror and go, why is it that so many people have lost faith in this system that apparently is making everyone so much better off and that apparently is working so well? Clearly, something is not working. And I think, giving that due consideration and giving people who are believers in conspiracy theories the kind of respect to listen to what they have to say and, again, not take them literally but seriously, I think that's part of a solution, but there might not be a solution.
What does that mean?
The storm. It's coming.
And what does it look like?
This is where I kind of end up with the book. We start the book with this kind of strange encounter at a drawing class with a story about a book that was published 500 years ago. By a crazed guy who was just obsessed with witches. And until he wrote this book, no one was really obsessed with witches in Europe. They were just like, they knew that the witches existed, but they were just part of the tapestry of feudal life. And then this guy writes this book, and he's like just bonkers, and he thinks that there's like satanic evil witches everywhere. And everyone thinks he's mad, but the printing press. So this book spreads, and suddenly witch fever, right? But witch fever is not the only thing that's happening then, right? The whole feudal order is being turned upside down, not just by the printing press, but by the gunpowder revolution, by double ledger banking, and you know, all sorts of things are changing, and the whole order is turned on its head. And it's hundreds of years of upheaval caused by new technology, driven by new technology. I think we're in another period of that right now. We're at the beginning of it, right? The internet, social media was the first start. Wait till AI starts like obliterating millions of jobs and making millions of people's existences in society redundant. What happens then? I think we are going to have this huge turbulence. And does it seem likely to me that we will come out the other side of that with the same system of kind of democratic governance, the same institutions that we went into it with? Probably about as likely as, you know, the idea that the feudal order would survive the Renaissance, right? It didn't. It was different. And there were some bumpy patches on the way. And was it better or was it worse? I don't know. But, you know, change.
Do you feel optimistic about anything?
I'm sorry. I'm a bit New Statesman branded mug, half empty at the moment. In fact, it's almost empty. I am naturally, I think, sort of constitutionally quite positive, and I think that's why.
I know, and that's what makes me actually really quite worried, because you are an optimist.
But I do think that there's trouble coming. I think there's trouble coming. I think there will be amazing things that come out of it. I think there will be terrible things that come out of it.
And do you think when you say there's trouble coming, presumably that's not confined to the United States of America?
No, I don't think it is. And, you know, the United States, for better or for worse, sort of controls a lot of what happens in the rest of the world. Yeah, when it grips America, it'll grip things here, and we've seen a lot of that. We saw that with the riots recently,
well,
right?
There's a passage in the book that really stood out to me, and I wonder if you think there's any time for Britain to learn some lessons from this, because you talk about actually sort of the diminishment of local news, and we have seen that here very sadly as well. And you're talking about millions and millions of Americans who essentially switch on their televisions or read their newspapers and they don't recognise what they see. And you write, many of the stories that made up the rich and varied tapestry of American life existed out of sight of the people who decided what passed for news, either because they didn't know about them or because they didn't fit the bigger national narrative. These stories told of an America slowly sinking in terminal decline. Many who lived that reality were experiencing a jarring sense of cognitive dissonance. And I wonder to what extent you think the riots this summer were a bit of that, and whether you think it's possible for us here in the UK to get hold of that a bit.
Yeah, I mean, that passage you read out, I was describing the 1990s.
Yeah.
And things have only got a lot worse in terms of local news provision, which is such an important part of democracy, right? You cannot have a healthy, flourishing democracy without an informed populace. And you can't have an informed populace if nobody is reporting the stuff that's going on around them, right? If they're just reporting what's happening in Westminster or the White House or Hollywood or, you know, the places where the centres of power, inevitably different things will be going on there, and people will start not recognising what they see. And then once they don't recognise it, then they don't believe it, then it's fake news, then you're all in on the cabal, and here we are. I don't see the trajectory of news. Was there a moment in the 90s and early noughties where the internet was going to step in and democratise news and give everybody a voice to be able to tell and read and see the stories from their local community and weave them in with the larger tapestry of a national life and bring people closer together? There was a moment where we believed that would happen, but it didn't happen, right? The opposite happened. We got 3, 4, 5 massive conglomerates who just like monopolized everything, Facebook, the rest of them. And we got something that was essentially worse than what we had before, where we had, you know, news barons and all of that. That ship has sailed, right? The internet is no longer the democratizing force we thought it was. I don't see at the moment any big drive towards somebody putting money and resources and care into rejuvenating, reliable, good local journalism. I'm sorry, I don't see it. It'd be great if it happened.